Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into what European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called the mother of all deals, a historic trade agreement between India and the European Union that's sending shockwaves through Washington and could fundamentally reshape the global economic order. This isn't just another trade deal. This is a $27 trillion market representing 2 billion people and 25% of global GDP. And the timing? It couldn't be more provocative. As President Trump's trade wars escalate and American tariffs reach punitive levels, two of the world's largest economies just bypassed Washington entirely to forge their own path forward. So buckle up, because what you're witnessing is nothing less than a historic realignment of global economic power. Let's break down exactly what happened, why Washington is furious, and what this means for the future of international trade. First, let's talk about the sheer scale of what just happened. After nearly 2 decades of on and off negotiations, India and the EU announced Tuesday that they've concluded what Modi called India's biggest and most historic free trade agreement. Here's what's in the deal. India will reduce or eliminate tariffs on 96.6% of EU exports. We're talking about massive tariff cuts on European automobiles, machinery, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, wine, and spirits. European cars, which currently face tariffs of up to 110%, will gradually see those drop to just 10%, with a quota allowing 250,000 vehicles annually to enter the Indian market. Meanwhile, the EU will reciprocate by eliminating or reducing tariffs on 99.5% of goods imported from India over the next 7 years. This is huge for India's labor-intensive export sectors: textiles, apparel, leather goods, gems and jewelry, engineering products, footwear, and marine products. These are exactly the sectors that have been crushed by Trump's 50% tariffs on Indian goods. The numbers are staggering. Trade between India and the EU has already grown from $74 billion in 2020 to $136 billion in 2024-2025. With this agreement, both sides are aiming to hit $200 billion by 2030. The EU expects to double its exports to India by 2032, while India gains unprecedented access to 144 services subsectors across the European market. But here's the kicker. This isn't just about trade. India and the EU also announced a new security and defense partnership similar to what the EU has with Japan and South Korea. This is about India reducing its dependence on Russian military hardware, while Europe reduces its dependence on American security guarantees. That's a strategic realignment that goes far beyond economics. Now, to understand why this deal is so explosive, we need to talk about what's been happening between the United States and India over the past year. And folks, it has been ugly. Let me paint you a picture. In April 2025, the Trump administration hit India with 25% reciprocal tariffs as part of what they called Liberation Day. But that was just the opening salvo. By August, Trump had doubled down, imposing an additional 25% tariff specifically targeting India's continued purchases of Russian oil, bringing the total duty to a devastating 50%, among the highest imposed on any American trading partner. Think about that for a second. 50% tariffs. That's not a negotiating tactic. That's economic warfare. Indian textiles, gems, jewelry, shrimp, and agricultural products were suddenly facing costs that made them uncompetitive in the American market overnight. India's response? They denounced the measures as unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike other countries that immediately caved or rushed to negotiate under pressure, India held firm. Prime Minister Modi made it crystal clear India will never compromise on the interests of the country's farmers, fishermen, and livestock breeders. I know it will cost me personally, but I am ready. And it wasn't just about the tariffs. The relationship deteriorated on multiple fronts. Trump claimed credit for mediating a ceasefire between India and Pakistan in May 2025, a claim India's defense minister flatly rejected as completely incorrect. There were reports suggesting India had paused major defense procurements from the US, though the Indian Defense Ministry denied these. And Trump started pursuing a rapprochement with Pakistan, India's arch-rival, including crypto business dealings that raised eyebrows about personal interests influencing foreign policy. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Remember, when Trump returned to office, 75% of Indians in one survey were classified as Trump welcomers. Modi wished heartiest congratulations to my friend Donald Trump. There was genuine optimism about the relationship. What happened instead was a systematic dismantling of trust. Analyst Jeffrey Sachs called Trump's tariffs a strategic error that would hurt the United States more than India, arguing they could isolate America, reduce its global competitiveness, and drive India closer to the BRICS alliance. Former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan went even further, citing Trump family business interests in Pakistan as evidence that personal finances were influencing foreign policy, calling it a huge strategic harm that undermines global confidence in the United States. Here's what makes India's position so fascinating. They didn't panic. While Trump's tariffs were designed to bring India to its knees, the Indian stock market barely flinched. The day after the US announced 50% tariffs, the Sensex, India's benchmark index, ended basically flat, up 0.1%. Why? Because India had been preparing for this moment. From bureaucrats to businesses, there was broad consensus that Trump's escalation was a pressure tactic to fast-track trade talks, not a permanent state of affairs. And India was willing to play the long game. The economic impact, while significant, was manageable. The most pessimistic estimate from Morgan Stanley suggested that if all goods faced the full 50% tariff, the hit to India's GDP would be about 60 basis points, roughly $23 billion at current exchange rates. Painful, but not catastrophic for the world's fastest-growing major economy. And here's the really clever part. While negotiations with Washington continued at what officials described as advanced stages, India simultaneously accelerated trade deals with everyone else. The EU deal is just one of 4 major trade agreements Modi has signed since May 2025. India also concluded deals with the UK, Oman, and New Zealand, and is actively pursuing partnerships with the Mercosur bloc, Chile, Peru, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. This is textbook strategic diversification. India is essentially telling Washington, we're happy to negotiate with you, but we're not dependent on you. We have options, and those options are paying off. Despite the tariffs, India's exports to the U.S. rebounded to $692 billion in November 2025, a 22% surge from $5.5 billion in September. India's economy grew at 8.2% in the third quarter, beating all estimates and making it clear that Indian growth would continue with or without American cooperation. Now let's talk about why this EU-India deal has Washington seeing red. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent didn't mince words. Speaking to ABC News, he criticized the EU for forging ahead with the India deal, saying, "We have put 25% tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. Guess what happened last week? The Europeans signed a trade deal with India." The frustration is palpable. From Washington's perspective, they've been using tariffs as leverage to force India to stop buying Russian oil and to extract better terms in bilateral negotiations. And just when that pressure should be working, India goes and signs a massive deal with Europe instead, a deal that explicitly helps India offset the impact of American tariffs. It gets worse. According to leaked audio reported by Axios, Republican Senator Ted Cruz has been openly criticizing Trump's trade policy within the administration. Cruz reportedly told donors that Trump's tariffs could devastate the economy and potentially lead to Trump's impeachment. He revealed that he and several other senators had urged the president to cancel the tariffs during a phone call, warning that they would lead to higher prices, hurt Americans' retirement savings, and could cost Republicans the House and Senate in the 2026 midterms. Trump's reported response, "Fuck you, Ted." This gives you a window into the chaos inside the Trump administration over trade policy. Cruz blamed Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and White House trade advisor Peter Navarro for impeding the trade deal with India, exposing deep fractures in the administration's approach. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick added another layer, suggesting the U.S.-India deal had stalled because Modi hadn't called Trump directly. According to Lutnick, he'd asked Modi to make the call to close the deal, but India was uncomfortable with the idea. The implication is clear. The Trump administration wants personal diplomacy and public deference, not just technical negotiations. But here's the strategic problem for Washington. While they're playing hardball with India, they're simultaneously signaling a potential accommodation with China. Trump accepted an invitation from President Xi Jinping to visit Beijing in April and plans to host a state dinner for Xi later in 2026. He called his October meeting with Xi highly successful. From India's perspective, this is the worst of both worlds. They're being punished with 50% tariffs, while China, their primary strategic rival, is getting red carpet treatment. As the Chicago Council on Global Affairs pointed out, the more that Beijing is seen as a severe threat, the more likely Washington is to look favorably toward India. But if Trump is comfortable with a sphere of influence arrangement with China and Asia, India would become a lower priority. Let's zoom out and talk about what this really means for global geopolitics, because this is where it gets truly fascinating. What we're witnessing is the potential end of the post-Cold War assumption that all roads lead through Washington. For decades, the United States was the indispensable node in the global trading system. If you wanted access to the world's largest consumer market, if you needed technology transfer, if you sought security guarantees, you went through Washington. That assumption is crumbling. The EU-India deal creates a trading bloc that rivals the United States in size and influence. 2 billion people, 27 trillion in combined GDP. 25% of global economic output. And crucially, it's not centered on America. This is what von der Leyen meant when she said the deal sends a strong message that cooperation is the best answer to global challenges. That's diplomatic speak for, we don't need Washington to make the global economy work. Now, some analysts argue this isn't necessarily a permanent realignment. The Council on Foreign Relations noted that unless trade disputes spill over into outright conflict, a complete geopolitical restructuring remains a distant prospect. The US and China still have major areas of contention: Taiwan, technology supremacy, maritime disputes in the South China Sea, and the structure of global trade itself. But here's what has changed. India now has genuine strategic alternatives. If the US relationship sours further, India can pivot toward Europe for economic partnership, continue buying Russian oil for energy security, and even cautiously engage with China to de-escalate border tensions. In fact, we've already seen signs of this. Modi attended a Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in China, a remarkable move after 5 years of simmering India-China tensions. His presence was widely read as signaling the possibility of a global geopolitical realignment. The symbolism matters. As Time magazine put it, we're seeing a world in which major powers increasingly rely on public theater, transactional bargains, and the symbolism of court-like diplomacy to project hierarchy and distribute favor. One spectacle unfolds in Tianjin, where China hosts the SCO and Modi's attendance signals India might be hedging its bets. Another unfolds in Washington, where world leaders make pilgrimages to placate Trump in hopes of securing favorable trade terms. India is playing both courts. And that optionality is precisely what Washington fears most. We can't ignore the security implications of this deal. The EU-India Security and Defense Partnership announced alongside the trade agreement is hugely significant. For decades, India has been overwhelmingly dependent on Russia for military hardware, a relationship dating back to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was India's primary weapons supplier. Even today, roughly 60% of India's military equipment has Russian origins. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine and India's balancing act between Moscow, Washington, and Beijing have made this dependence increasingly untenable. India has been actively trying to diversify its defense suppliers, boosting domestic manufacturing while looking to new partners. Enter the EU. By offering India a security and defense partnership similar to what they have with Japan and South Korea, Europe is positioning itself as a viable alternative supplier and strategic partner. This isn't about replacing the US-India strategic partnership entirely, that would be premature, but it's about giving India options. And here's the kicker. Europe is doing this partly because of Trump. As one EU official noted, Brussels is trying to reduce its own dependence on Washington for security guarantees. If the United States is an unreliable partner under Trump, and the evidence suggests it is, then Europe needs its own strategic relationships in Asia. This creates a fascinating dynamic. India and Europe are both hedging against American unpredictability by deepening ties with each other. The result is a potential new axis in global affairs, a Euro-Indian partnership that doesn't need American blessing to function. So where does this leave us? What happens next in this unfolding drama? First, let's talk about the US-India trade negotiations, because they're still ongoing despite the EU deal. Indian officials keep saying they're at an advanced stage. Trump himself told Money Control during the World Economic Forum that he has great respect for Modi, calling him a fantastic man and a friend of mine, and expressing confidence they'll have a good deal. Commerce Secretary Piyush Goyal has indicated that India and the US are close to an initial framework deal, possibly by February 2026. The goal is ambitious, expanding bilateral trade from the current $191 billion to $500 billion by 2030. But here's the question. What kind of deal will it be? Will the United States accept that it no longer has the leverage it once had, now that India has secured a massive alternative market in Europe? Or will Trump double down on tariffs and demands, potentially pushing India even further toward Europe and other partners? The answer matters enormously. As Kenneth Juster, former U.S. ambassador to India, wrote for the Council on Foreign Relations, continued tensions could have deep implications for U.S. economic security and grand strategy in Asia. The United States has spent 2 decades building India up as a strategic counterweight to China. Throwing that away over trade disputes and personal pique would be a historic strategic blunder. There are signs of flexibility. Reports suggest that if a U.S.-India deal is reached, tariffs on diamonds could be eliminated entirely. De Beers CEO Al Cook confirmed that the U.S. has announced that once there's a deal, natural diamonds will face 0 tariffs. That's a significant concession, given that tariffs had nearly halved India's diamond exports to America. But the bigger picture is uncertain. The Trump administration is deeply divided on trade policy, with hawks like Peter Navarro pulling in one direction and dealmakers like Treasury Secretary Bessent pulling in another. Senator Cruz's leaked audio suggests there's a real concern within Republican ranks that Trump's trade wars could cost them politically. Meanwhile, India seems comfortable playing the waiting game. They've demonstrated they can sustain economic growth despite American tariffs. They've secured alternative markets through the EU, UK, Oman, and New Zealand deals. They've shown they won't be bullied or rushed into concessions that undermine their core interests. As India's oil minister Hardeep Singh Puri put it when asked about the U.S. relationship, everybody needs to chill a bit. That's not the language of a country desperate to placate Washington. That's the language of a rising power that knows it has options. So let me bring this all together. What we're witnessing with the EU-India mother of all deals is a fundamental test of American power in the 21st century. For decades, the United States could use market access as a weapon, confident that there were no real alternatives to the American consumer market and the dollar-dominated global financial system. But what happens when other major economies decide they can trade with each other just fine without Washington's blessing? That's the question this deal poses. India and the EU have created a $27 trillion trading bloc that doesn't require American participation. They've added security and defense cooperation that provides India with alternatives to Russian weapons and American technology. They've sent a message to the world that multilateral cooperation can still deliver great outcomes, von der Leyen's words, even as America pursues aggressive unilateralism. The tension in Washington isn't just about lost trade revenue or bruised egos, though there's plenty of both. It's about the realization that American economic and political leverage might not be what it once was. When your tariffs push your partners into each other's arms instead of to the negotiating table, you've lost the game. Now, I want to be clear. This doesn't mean American power is over or that the U.S.-India relationship is finished. Far from it. India still values its strategic partnership with Washington, particularly as a counterweight to China. The United States remains the world's largest economy and most powerful military. But the rules of engagement have changed. India has demonstrated it can and will pursue its strategic autonomy, even when that conflicts with American preferences. Europe has shown it's willing to make major deals that explicitly offset American tariff policies. And together, they've proven that alternatives to the U.S.-centered trading system not only exist, but can be quite attractive. The question for Washington is whether it recognizes this new reality and adjusts accordingly, or whether it continues down the path of tariff escalation and transactional diplomacy that has already cost it so much credibility and influence. As for the rest of us watching this unfold, buckle up. The global economic order is being rewritten in real time, and the outcome is far from certain. What is certain is that the mother of all deals between India and the EU will be remembered as a watershed moment, the point at which the world's democracies proved they could cooperate and thrive without Washington's permission. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how this plays out. Will the US and India find common ground, or are we watching the birth of a new global order? I want to hear what you think. Until next time, stay informed, stay skeptical, and keep asking questions. Peace.